There are places on this earth that carry the weight of history so heavily that the very ground beneath your feet feels different. Where the soil is darker, richer, not from rain or rivers, but from blood soaked deep into the limestone over 100 years ago. Verdun is one of those places. Today, if you visit the hills and ridges northeast of the small French city of Verdun-sur-Meuse, you will notice something unusual. The land is not flat. It rolls and dips in strange, unnatural patterns, like a lunar surface covered in craters, some still visible, some swallowed by forest. The trees that grow here are thin and pale. The soil is still poisonous in places, and beneath it all, the bones of tens of thousands of men who were never recovered. In 1916, this landscape was hell on earth. The Battle of Verdun lasted 303 days, nearly 10 months, making it the longest single battle of the First World War. It consumed over 700,000 men, killed or wounded on both sides. It obliterated entire villages so completely that the French government, after the war, declared them officially dead. Communes that exist today only as names on a sign, with no living inhabitants, no houses, no streets. Ghost towns written into law. Verdun was not just a battle, it was a machine designed by one German general specifically to bleed France to death. This is the story of how that machine was built, how it was fed, and why it ultimately failed to finish what it started. To understand Verdun, you first need to understand what Verdun meant to France before a single shot was fired in 1916. The city of Verdun had been a military strongpoint for centuries. It sat at the edge of a salient, a bulge in the French front line, surrounded by a ring of forts built after the humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. That earlier war had scarred the French national psyche deeply. Germany had taken Alsace and Lorraine. France had vowed never again. And so they built Fort Douaumont, Fort Voie, Fort Souville, a constellation of concrete and steel embedded into the hills designed to be impregnable. By the standards of 1914, they were. But the war that began in August of that year had a way of making everything that came before it obsolete within months. The fortresses of Liège in Belgium, considered equally impenetrable, fell within days to German siege artillery. The lesson was brutal and clear. Fixed fortifications could be shattered. In response, the French military command, under Joseph Joffre, made a decision that would later haunt them. In 1915, he stripped many of the Verdun forts of their heavy guns, pulling the artillery for use on other parts of the front where the static trench war ground on. Verdun's forts were left like hollow shells. Their armor remained, their teeth had been pulled. This decision, made in secrecy and with quiet confidence, was a catastrophic miscalculation. Because in the autumn of 1915, on the other side of the front, a German general named Erich von Falkenhayn was drawing up the most coldly calculated plan of the entire war. Erich von Falkenhayn was the chief of the German General Staff in 1915, a man of sharp intelligence and brutal pragmatism. He had concluded something that few commanders on either side were willing to admit out loud. Germany could not win the war by conventional military means. The Western Front was deadlocked. Frontal assaults, no matter how massive, produced only slaughter and little ground. And so Falkenhayn devised a different kind of strategy altogether. He did not plan to break through the French lines. He planned to destroy the French army as a fighting force, not by defeating it in a single decisive battle, but by luring it into a position where it would bleed itself to death defending ground it could never afford to give up. He chose Verdun deliberately. In a memorandum that would later become infamous, sometimes called the Christmas Memorandum, written in December 1915, Falkenhayn argued that France was close to its breaking point, that the French army and the French people had suffered so greatly that one more sustained blow in the right place could shatter their will entirely. He wrote that the French must be bled white. The German word for the operation was Gericht, which translates roughly as place of execution or judgment. The name was not accidental. Verdun was chosen for 3 reasons. First, it was psychologically and symbolically invaluable to France. Losing it would be a national catastrophe beyond military calculation. Second, its geography meant that France would have to funnel reinforcements through a narrow corridor. The road from Bar-le-Duc, that would become known as the Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. That corridor could be shelled, choked, exhausted. And third, the salient around Verdun meant that German artillery could fire into the French positions from 3 sides simultaneously. It was, in military terms, a killing ground. On the 21st of February, 1916, at 7:15 in the morning, more than 1,200 German guns opened fire along a front of just 12 kilometers. For 9 hours, they poured shells into French positions. The bombardment was the largest and most concentrated in the history of warfare to that point. The noise was heard 150 kilometers away, and then the German infantry advanced. The first days of the battle were a catastrophe for France. The French defenders, already depleted and caught off guard by the ferocity of the assault, fell back. Entire regiments were wiped out or scattered. Communication lines were severed. Officers lost contact with their men. Men lost contact with their officers. The landscape itself was transformed. Forests became matchsticks. Trenches became craters. Craters became graves. On the 25th of February, just 4 days into the battle, something happened that shocked the entire French high command. Fort Douaumont fell. Fort Douaumont was the largest and most powerful fort in the Verdun defensive ring. It sat on the highest ridge north of the city, a massive structure of concrete and steel designed to withstand the heaviest bombardment. And it fell without a fight, not because of a massive assault, but because of a small German patrol. A group of fewer than 10 German soldiers crept into the fort through an unguarded entry point, wandered through its corridors, and found it nearly empty. The garrison had been reduced to a handful of men. The guns Joffre had removed the previous year had never been replaced. The fall of Douaumont was a psychological earthquake. In Germany, church bells rang in celebration. In France, there was horror. If the strongest fort could fall in 4 days, what hope was there? General Joffre's response was to turn to the one man he believed could hold Verdun, Philippe Pétain. Pétain, who would later become one of the most controversial figures in French history, was at that moment a general of uncommon practicality and clarity. He cared, unusually for the era, about the lives of his soldiers. He insisted on rotation, on pulling units out of Verdun after a set period and replacing them with fresh troops, rather than leaving exhausted men in the line indefinitely. This rotation system, which eventually cycled roughly 70% of the entire French army through Verdun, gave the battle its particular horror for France. Nearly every Frenchman who served in the war had been there, had seen what it was, had smelled it. But Pétain also organized the one artery that kept Verdun alive, the road south to Bar-le-Duc. There was only one road that connected Verdun to the French rear. It was a narrow, poorly surfaced secondary road, not even a main route. Before the battle, no one had paid it much attention. After the battle began, it became the most important road in France. Pétain immediately understood that Verdun could only survive if it was continuously supplied, with ammunition, with food, with men, with everything the front required. And all of it had to come down that single road. He organized the supply effort with obsessive precision. Trucks, thousands of them, were requisitioned from across France. They ran day and night in a continuous stream, headlights blazing through the darkness. A truck passed every 14 seconds. Maintenance teams worked by the roadside, repairing vehicles on the spot so that the flow never stopped. At its peak, the Sacred Way carried 6,000 tons of supplies every single day. It was a logistical miracle, and it was the reason Verdun did not fall. The road also carried men, hundreds of thousands of them, moving into the battle, and what remained of them moving back out. Soldiers who survived described the journey in words of quiet dread. You could hear the guns before you reached the front. You could feel the ground shake, and as you traveled deeper toward the line, you passed the men coming the other way, hollow-eyed, silent, some of them unable to walk without support, some of them not walking at all. Those who came back from Verdun were changed. Every account, every memoir, every letter home from that battle carries a particular quality, not just of suffering, but of something more fundamental being altered. Men wrote that they had seen the end of the world, that they had stopped being afraid of death because they were already living beyond it. Through the spring and summer of 1916, the battle settled into a pattern of grinding, concentrated horror that defied any conventional military logic. The Germans pushed, the French held, then the French counterattacked. Then the Germans pushed again. The line moved back and forth across the same hills, the same craters, the same ruins, measuring progress in hundreds of meters, paying for each meter with hundreds of lives. The conditions were unlike anything soldiers on either side had experienced, even after nearly 2 years of trench warfare. The artillery was constant and obliterating. German guns fired an estimated 22 million shells into the Verdun sector over the course of the battle. French guns replied in kind. The entire landscape was so saturated with high explosive that the ground itself became unstable. Men fell into shell craters and were buried alive by the next detonation. The mud was not simply mud. It was a mixture of earth, shattered wood, equipment, and the decomposed remains of the dead. Men reported stepping on things that moved and not daring to look down. Poison gas was used extensively, phosgene, chlorine, and later mustard gas, adding a new layer of invisible death to the landscape. A man could walk through an area that looked clear and begin to die hours later, his lungs slowly filling with fluid. Fort Voie fell to the Germans in June after one of the most brutal small unit battles of the entire war. The French garrison held for 7 days against an assault that included German soldiers pumping poison gas directly into the tunnels. The commander of the garrison, Major Sylvain Eugène Raynal, surrendered only when his men had eaten the last of their food and drunk their own urine. The German crown prince, opposing him, sent him a sword in recognition of the defense. It was one of the few gestures of chivalry in a battle that had almost none. By summer, the battle had consumed everything. The French were exhausted to the marrow, but so were the Germans. And then, on the 1st of July, 1916, the British launched the Battle of the Somme, the largest British military offensive in history, to the northwest. Nearly 20 German divisions were pulled from Verdun to reinforce the Somme. Falkenhayn's carefully constructed killing machine began to run short of fuel. In October 1916, after months of brutal defense, the French were ready to take back what they had lost. General Robert Nivelle, who had replaced Pétain in direct command at Verdun, launched a series of counteroffensives beginning on the 24th of October. They were ferocious, rapid, and extraordinarily effective. The French, having reorganized their artillery and concentrated their firepower with new precision, unleashed a storm of shells onto Fort Douaumont. The fort, which had been held by Germany since February, exploded from within when an ammunition magazine detonated. What remained of the German garrison fled. French infantry walked into Douaumont on the 24th of October, 8 months after losing it. Fort Voie was retaken on the 2nd of November. By December 1916, the French had pushed the German lines back nearly to where they had started in February. The ground that had consumed 300 days and 750,000 casualties had, in the end, changed hands almost not at all. Falkenhayn had been dismissed from command in August, a casualty of the very strategy he had designed. His plan to bleed France white had instead created a mutual bloodletting of almost incomprehensible scale. France had suffered. Germany had suffered equally, perhaps more. The machine had devoured both armies. The last significant French counterattack came on the 15th of December, pushing the German lines back another 4 kilometers. On the 18th of December 1916, the Battle of Verdun was declared over. It had lasted 303 days. What Verdun left behind was not simply a military result. A line on a map moved slightly, then moved back. What it left behind was something that has never fully healed. The villages. In the Verdun sector, 9 villages were so utterly destroyed during the battle, shelled into dust, their soil so contaminated with unexploded ordnance and toxic residue that the French government decided they could never be rebuilt. They were given a legal status unique in the world, communes mortes pour la France, communes that died for France. They exist today as civil entities, administered by local officials, with mayors elected by the French Senate. But no one lives there. No one ever will. Their names, Fleury devant Douaumont, Beaumont en Verdunois, Cumières-le-Mort Homme, are written on small signs at the roadside, marking where houses, churches, and bakeries once stood. Now there is only forest, and beneath the forest, craters, and beneath the craters, the things that the earth has not yet given back. The ossuary of Douaumont stands on the ridge above the battlefield, a long, low building of pale stone topped with a tower shaped like a shell. Inside, in the crypt, rest the remains of roughly 130,000 unidentified soldiers, French and German alike, gathered from the battlefield. Through small windows set into the base of the building, you can look directly in at the bones, femurs, skulls, ribs, stacked without ceremony, because there was no other way. They could not be buried individually. There were too many, and too few of them were whole. In front of the ossuary, 15,000 individual graves stretch across a lawn that seems to go on forever. Identical white crosses, row after row, each one a name, a date, a unit. And yet those 15,000 represent only a fraction of the dead. Every year, farmers in the Verdun region still unearth shells from their fields, sometimes live ones, sometimes the bones they accompany. There is a unit of the French army, the Détachement Spécialisé de Sécurité Pyrotechnique, whose sole job is to collect and safely detonate the unexploded ordnance that the war left behind. They work year-round. They have been working since 1919. They estimate they will be working for at least another 2 centuries. The Earth is still digesting 1916. History has given Verdun many meanings, and not all of them agree with one another. For France, Verdun became the supreme symbol of national sacrifice and endurance, the proof that France could suffer the unimaginable and not break. Ils ne passeront pas, they shall not pass, became the defining phrase of French resistance, not only in 1916, but again in the 1940s and in every generation since. Philippe Pétain became a national hero at Verdun, a fame that would turn to infamy when he led the collaborationist Vichy government 24 years later in another war on the same soil. For Germany, Verdun was a wound that festered in the national memory, not a defeat exactly, but a horror without redemption. Falkenhayn's cold calculus had consumed German men as thoroughly as French ones. The German writer Ernst Jünger, who served on the Western Front, described the war as a forge, as something that hardened men into something new and terrible. Other German veterans described Verdun simply as the end of something, without being able to name what it was. For soldiers on both sides, Verdun defied military language entirely. It was not a campaign. It was not a battle in any traditional sense. The French writer Jules Romain called it the greatest tragedy of the human race. The German philosopher Ernst Bloch wrote that at Verdun, industrial civilization had turned its most advanced tools not toward progress but toward slaughter, and that the world after Verdun could never pretend otherwise. Historians have debated Falkenhayn's intentions for a century. Did he really design the battle to bleed France white? Was that the plan from the beginning, or did the Christmas memorandum reflect a rationalization after the fact, written to justify a strategy that became something other than what was intended? The debate continues, but in practical terms, it may not matter. Whatever Falkenhayn intended, what he created was a furnace. And furnaces do not ask for the intentions of those who light them. What is certain is this: Verdun changed how war was fought and how war was understood. It demonstrated that industrial states could sustain casualties that would have ended any previous conflict, that the machinery of the modern nation could feed men into the fire faster than the fire could consume them. This was not a comfort, it was a horror, because it meant the fire could burn for years, and it did. There is a particular quality to the silence at Verdun. It is not the silence of emptiness, it is the silence of weight, of a place that has absorbed more human suffering than can be fully comprehended, and that holds it still in the tree roots and the stone and the pale grass growing over the craters. More than 100 years have passed since the guns fell quiet in December 1916. The men who fought here, French, German, Moroccan, Algerian, American, are all gone now, their voices surviving only in letters and diaries and official records. The last living veteran of the First World War died in 2012. The direct living memory of Verdun belongs now to history, and history belongs to us. What does Verdun ask of us? Perhaps simply this: to remember that the names on the crosses were not numbers, that behind each name was a life, a language, a family, a morning someone woke up and ate breakfast and did not know it would be among their last, that the decision to build a machine designed to bleed human beings to death, coolly, strategically, as a function of logistics and attrition, was a decision made by real men in real offices with maps and calculations and clean hands, and that the men who died on those hills had no such clean hands and no such maps, only mud and noise and each other in whatever was left of the moments they had. In 1984, the French President François Mitterrand and the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl stood together at the ossuary of Douaumont and joined hands. Two old men, one French, one German, standing above the bones of the enemies their countries had once sent to kill each other. It was a gesture without words, and it said everything. Verdun is a name that carries both the worst of what human beings can do to one another and the possibility, slow, imperfect, painful, of something different. The ground remembers. We should too.